Welcome to this first lecture in European history. This is Mr. King, and we're going to work on the topic today, women in Renaissance Italy, and the question, what was it like for women? And in particular, we're going to look at Renaissance Italy, but I think we can extend beyond Italy when we talk about women in Western society in general. So we're going to get started with this first set of images. You see the Principality of Urbino, which is in that red Papal States area, and it's right below the city of San Marino. So it was a very small principality, but a very influential one in that it had a very important court led by Guidobaldo da Montefeltro and his wife that you see there pictured on the left. That is Elisabetta Gonzaga, and she hails from Mantua, another one of these Italian city-states. And what made Urbino and Mantua interesting is, unlike Florence and Venice that were republics, Urbino and Mantua and later other city-states we'll see were principalities. That is, they were ruled by a prince. And what's interesting about the Principality of Urbino is that, and what made it unique during the Renaissance was that it was a court ruled by women, in fact ruled by Elisabetta. And that's in large part because Elisabetta's husband, the Duke Guidobaldo, was very ill, bedridden, and simply put couldn't rule. So Elisabetta took up that function at the court. And so one historian, Professor Bartlett of the University of Toronto, has called Urbino a world turned upside down. And that is, it was a place that did not fit the normal political and social patterns of the time period that we're looking at. And in stark contrast to Urbino, however, many historians have argued that women had no Renaissance at all. Rather stark statement. And other historians have even argued that women had more power and more status in the Middle Ages, a time in which, for example, they could own property independently of men. So we're going to look into this topic of women today in this lecture. So while it is difficult to generalize when we talk about this, we want to ask a couple of questions before we get to this slide. And the first question is, so what did women do in the Renaissance, in the Italian peninsula in particular? And by that I mean, what privileges, what prerogatives did they have? Did they get educated? Did they have hopes and ambitions outside the home, outside marriage? And those are all things that we're going to look at that. But let's just start with this idea first, and we're going to borrow a term from the corporate, that is the business world, and that is subsidiary. So what is a subsidiary? Well, I think you see in the diagram there's a parent corporation that owns other smaller corporations under it, and you can see there 100% subsidiary, 50%. In this case, we're going to say that women were 100% the subsidiaries of the parent corporation, and that parent corporation we intend, or I intend to mean, the patriarchal world of Renaissance Italy and in fact much of Europe. That is, men ruled and women were subsidiaries of men in all cases. So right off the bat we see, if we go back to one of the original questions, what's the role of women in the Renaissance, that is, what privileges, prerogatives did they have, we're going to see right away that they didn't have many. If we accept this idea that they were subsidiaries. So moving along, let's look at the question then of what women could do. And there are roughly four things, and I have three of the four things pictured here. There's one thing missing. I think you'll understand why, maybe. So marriage, and that was probably the biggest thing, the biggest calling, vocation for women in the Renaissance, especially women from families of means, that is, the well-to-do families. We'll talk more about that in a bit. You see a convent there pictured on the right, so women could enter into a life of devotion to God in a religious community for women, nuns. You see also pictured there a series of women dressed in white aprons and caps holding brooms, and women could enter into domestic service. Cleaning, preparing food, taking care of children, and other household activities that were very important. The last and fourth thing not pictured here is prostitution. And ironically, prostitution was one of the few entrepreneurial jobs that were open to women, but it came with a heavy moral price, and it was considered then and now a deplorable business. So those are the basic options open to women. We will see at the very end of this lecture several exceptions to the rule. So one of the things that we need to do when we are in the Renaissance, we need to remember that the Renaissance looked back to the classical past, both its literature and its laws. And here on the right you see a group of Roman men discussing the law. I believe they're praetors, that is, they would have been judges in classical Rome. You see them seated in their white togas, all men, and they're the ones that discussed the law, they're the ones that wrote the law, they're the ones that enforced the law. So I think you get the picture that when we look back to classical Rome with regards to women, we don't see women, and therefore we can conclude that Roman law really worked against an active role for women as autonomous agents in society. Women could not own property in their own names. Women could not represent themselves in courts of law, and women depended on men for most important decisions in a woman's life. So if that was true in classical Greece and Rome, I think we can say that that's going to be true in the Renaissance, as the Renaissance scholars that we call humanists look back to the precedents established by Greece and Rome. So in many ways, we can see that the classical world does women no favor. And it's also true that in the Renaissance, the family was a very patriarchal institution. And you can see here a family, an American family from the 1950s, from a television series, I believe, that shows this idea of patriarchy, and the fact that it existed in American TV series in the 1950s also suggests that patriarchy lived a really long life. So in short, the male was the head of the household, and he ruled the household as a sovereign leader, making all sorts of decisions for the people in his household. Men, and he made decisions for boys too, so that is also something we should remember. But certainly for the girls, there were strict protocols that had to be followed. And so this is really strange to us today, I believe, this idea of a patriarchal world, though traces of it still exist in parts of Europe, and certainly if you go beyond Europe to areas such as Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia, and to territories controlled by ISIS, I think you can safely say that they're patriarchal societies even today in the world, though not in the West where we live. So let's take a look at this idea of marriage, again, the highest calling. And when we're talking about marriage, again, I want to remind you, we're talking about marriage of women from families of great means. So marriage, and subsequently the bearing of children, was a woman's highest calling in the Renaissance. And in order for a woman of means to be considered seriously on the marriage market, sounds strange, right? A girl had to possess an unblemished reputation, both physically, morally, and spiritually. The standard for girls was high, and there was no margin for error. And I do believe that there existed a double standard for girls and boys, and maybe it still does today to some extent, where boys could behave in certain ways that girls, simply put, could never do, for risk of bringing a family's reputation down and into disrepute, which would then harm the family's interests. So, and of course, one of the biggest things, the highest standards for all girls prior to marriage was virginity, and that was an absolute rule, and virginity had to be preserved in order to fetch a higher bride price, and also to protect a family's honor, which was very important in a patriarchal world. So, given the high stakes of a girl's purity, girls and families of means were rigorously trained for marriage, and this included learning and practicing three things: chastity, virtue, and obedience. Chastity, virtue, and obedience. Nothing about learning the great works of literature from the classical past, trying to apply those to the business enterprises or to politics in the city-states. It was simple: chastity, virtue, and obedience. Girls were also never left alone with another male that was not an immediate family. except when a girl went to church to confess to the priest. That was the only time a girl would be alone with a male. And of course, writers and authors are going to make much of this idea of the lecherous priest who preyed on innocent girls in confessional booths. And one needs read Boccaccio and some of his tales that are wonderfully rich in satire, but also wonderfully bawdy as well. Another important point about marriage that has to be made is marriage was not based on love. So if not love, then what? And that's what we're going to begin to look at when we look at this slide. So marriage, love versus contract. And at this point, I think love is not an issue here. Marriage was based on the transfer of property and status that would further a family's interest. It was simply put a social and economic instrument that could maintain or advance a family's wealth and status in society, and one in which personal feelings and emotions were not considered. Now, according to Professor Bartlett of the University of Toronto, the average age of marriage for girls in the Renaissance, that is, girls of means, was 16 to 17 to 18 years of age. And in order for girls to marry, number one, they had to be physically mature. That is, they had to be able to bear children. And they also had to be mature enough emotionally and cognitively to be able to run a household and to be a good companion to a husband that is of sound mind and good temperament. Husbands, on the other hand, were generally much older and well established in life and were in need of both companionship but also heirs, that is, children, to continue the family, and they needed somebody to run the household and look after the kids and all of those domestic things. Now, one interesting fact regarding marriage is that forced marriages were not recognized by the church. So consent of both parties was required, yet I would argue that consent may not mean what we think it does today, though consent is back in the news, if I'm not mistaken, especially on college campuses of late for whatever reason, I don't know. But oftentimes this consent came under great duress, and a great deal of pressure could be applied to girls, again 16, 17, and 18, by their patriarchal families into consenting to marriage, even if that wasn't something that the girl was terribly interested in. So, in short, girls did not get to say no. The other thing you see up here are two pictures. One, the idea of matchmaking. So matchmaking puts together two people, just like you're putting a plug together to create a flow of electricity. Matchmaking was a common thing among wealthy families who relied on the services of these consultants to ensure that this choice was going to be something that would benefit the families. So it's an elaborate process, and it really starts with the idea of girls coming out, and usually that was done by word of mouth. So a family with a girl, 16, 17, 18, would announce to the city-state, the town, the society, that their daughter was eligible for marriage. Eligible men in the community would then begin to take stock of the nubile, girls of marriageable age, and men would start to take stock of the offerings, if you will, by weighing certain factors: level of wealth, family status, reputation, business interests, and whether a family was rising or falling. So men are looking at this very much through the lens of business, and women's families are too, by the way. So once a girl was identified as a suitable match for a man, negotiations began between the two families. And again, I mentioned that there were marriage brokers that provided this service. If the initial negotiations were positive, then a serious discussion of the dowry was established. Now, what's a dowry? The dowry was the bride price. Could be money, that is, coins, gold, silver. It could be land. It could be jewelry. It could be other items that were considered valuable, silk, fabrics, etc. But the family, so then the family of the bride had to provide this dowry to the groom's family, and this is what we call the bride price. And you can see here on the balance, there's the the bride to be on the left, and a pile of money and a money bag and possessions on the right. So this is the beginning of the idea of the marriage contract. And with that, I'm going to stop this lecture, and we'll pick up in lecture 2 on women next time. Thank you.